The dormant Democrat Party must find a way to revive itself if it's to have any hope of challenging the MAGA movement, Donald Trump, and his eventual successor. The party is split on whether Trump is simply an aberration to endure or whether he represents the death of democracy, justifying a dirtier form of opposition politics. I'm joined by the New Statesman's US correspondent, Freddie Hayward, speaking to us from Washington, D.C. Hi, Freddie.
Hello.
Can you just tell us what it is like reporting from Washington day in, day out? I mean, obviously, the city must have undergone quite a big cultural change since the re-election of Donald Trump.
Yeah, so every 4 years, or normally every 4 years, perhaps every 8 years, the old guard is shunted out naturally because so many of the appointments in Washington are political. That means that if the Democrats and the Republican wins, they leave. So there's inevitably a cultural shift. But on top of that, we've had the DOGE cuts, which really cut into the federal government itself, the non-political appointees. That means that you've had swathes of people leave the city who, if we're being honest, were obviously a little bit more liberal than the Republicans that were coming in. Washington is a very democratic city. So you have had this shift. I would say in January, around the inauguration, it was very celebratory. There were lots of besuited young MAGA men sort of strolling through the streets. And maybe that celebratory attitude has calmed down now. We're 6 months into the administration. The big, beautiful bill has been passed. The focus is very much turned onto the midterms. Trump's grip on the party, I wouldn't say has lessened, but there have been some threats to that grip and to that unity. We've seen some splits, particularly over the Jeffrey Epstein saga, which we talked about last week. So it's slightly less confident, I would say. The Democrats are trying to reboot themselves to regain some momentum. They're struggling to do that, but they're definitely woken up a little bit from their defeat. I mean, for 6 months they were essentially petrified by their failure. There was lots of recriminations and discussion about where they went wrong, but it took them a long time, I think, mentally to come to terms with their loss and to try and figure out where they go from here.
Yeah, and you decide at the beginning of the piece to go and report from a neighbourhood, Nomar neighbourhood, and it's sort of a victim of what you describe as liberal flight. Can you explain why you chose to go to this particular area and sort of what it reflects about the Democrats, but also the state of the left in general?
Yeah, there was this protest that I'd heard about the week before, and it was one of these noise disruptions. You know that they're supposed to make lots of noise to in effect have their voice heard. And I went, and 6 o'clock came around, and it was outside a subway station, and it was just me and the 3 organisers. It was the first. I've been to many protests. This was the first protest I've ever been to when no one turned up, literally no one. So it was a very awkward situation. But I thought it was fascinating that in this liberal progressive neighbourhood, Kamala Harris had decided to do what she hoped would be her victory speech, just a short cycle ride up the road, that no one turned up. There were people, these liberal professionals, streaming out of the subway station, ignoring the entreaties from the organisers to join. They just weren't interested. And
what was the protest about? Sorry, just to explain.
So the protest, it was organised by an organisation called Refuse Fascism. It was essentially about calling the whistle on ICE, as they phrased it. ICE is the immigration deportation army that Trump's funded, and they're the main people that are going around and deporting the undocumented migrants. So this was essentially an anti-Trump protest, as you would expect, and the very fact that no one really wanted to join it, I thought was very symptomatic of how street politics in America at large, but Washington is, in particular, is no longer having the same effect. Cast your mind back to 2017 when we had some of the biggest marches that America has seen this century. The Women's March, for instance, was huge. There was this sense that people could get onto the streets, have their voice heard, and there was an expectation that might have an effect on politics. That seems to have completely dissipated. I've been to a few of these protests now. The biggest one was in May, which I think was reported to be about 20, 30,000, around about that. These numbers are always wrong, necessarily. And it was a disparate group of people, trans rights activists, pro-immigration groups, which is always the case. You remember the 1967 march on the Pentagon? I think there was 100 different organizations. It was always the case, but it felt a bit flaccid and wandering and aimless, and there hasn't been the sense that the street matters as much, which I think says a lot about the despondency within the left-wing movement at large and the Democratic Party on the base.
Well, it's interesting because I think you end up in a bar after this. You seem to end up in a bar quite a lot. I hope you're using the new Statesman expenses account for all of these drinks. But something that the conversation actually that struck me most from your piece is you speak to this guy in a bar afterwards. I think he's a manager at a corporate of some kind. And he seems quite normcore, for want of a better word. But he has an alternative to this idea of sort of street politics and protest. He casually tells you that tech billionaires should be killed. I mean, is that why did you decide to report that conversation? Is there a shift in how people are thinking that you've noticed, characterized by that kind of thing?
I found it a fascinating conversation because it was this person on the face of it who was very successful, married, good job, seemed to be making decent money, and he had lost faith in traditional politics, and he wanted to revert to these more extreme measures. And the reason I included it is that it is emblematic of a wider shift within the left. I mean, ever since the Luigi Mangione assassination of a health insurance chief executive, there has been, I would say, an acceptance, or at least a refusal to explicitly condemn political violence on the left. We saw a couple of months ago another attack where 2 members of the Israeli embassy were shot in Washington. And the interesting thing from my perspective is that there has been this broader shift away from what would normally be an Islamist attack to it being a left-wing attack. And I think that's a shift that's very much new. It harks back to, whether it's the anarchists in Russia in the late 19th century or the Red Brigade in Italy with the years of lead. And I think it speaks to the frustration with traditional politics and with democracy. And it also speaks to an acceptance of a version of extremism that 5 years ago was not seen as a plausible political outlet.
And there's sort of a reflection of that debate, maybe not in such extreme terms, within the party, isn't there? I mean, you talk about those Democrats who think that they need to do a sort of dirtier form of opposition politics to match Donald Trump's style, rather than, when they go low, we go high style approach.
Yeah, there's this split in the party, in the congressional party, in the Democratic congressional party, between those who think, and this side I think is lessening and shrinking, that Trump is an aberration. He's a unique figure who will eventually pass, and normal politics will be restored in some form. So essentially, the argument is he's got 1 term left. Let's wait it out. Whoever succeeds him won't be this Trumpian man of history who can sort of reject all conventions and norms, and they will have to again abide by some sense of commonality and decorum and courtesy and these sorts of things. Then there is a growing group within Congress that thinks, no, this is a unique time, and therefore we need to act in unique ways. And people like Cory Booker, for instance, Senator Cory Booker would say this. So they're looking to more extreme methods within Congress, so they're still within the Democratic theatre. So that means, for instance, blocking budgets, even if it leads to a government shutdown. There's this broader debate going on in Washington at the moment and across the country about redrawing districts. Trump has been quite explicit that in order to win the midterms, he will pressure governors and state legislatures to redraw congressional districts to help the Democrats win more seats. The main focus right now is in Texas. The Democratic state lawmakers there have actually fled the state. They got on a chartered plane over the weekend, flew to Illinois so that they could essentially shut down the state legislature because there
Right.
wouldn't be enough people to be there for a quorum for enough people to
Right.
vote. So this debate is leading to a big cascade of responses around the country. Gavin Newsom, the governor of California, has said that, well, if you redraw the map in Texas to ensure that there are more Republican representatives, we'll do the same in California to make sure that there are an equal number more of Democratic representatives. Ditto in New York. We've seen similar talk in Missouri and Florida. So there is this essentially this race, this arms race of, okay, fine, what you're doing, Mr. President, is threatening to upend these democratic norms, so therefore we're going to do the same in order to stop you. So it's this classic question of whether the means justify the ends, of whether liberals in an age of populism have to sacrifice some of their principles in order to protect liberalism. So it's a constant paradox, and it seems as if the momentum at the moment is with the side of the party that says we need to take these measures, we need to be slightly more extreme.
Now, Freddie, we started our conversation by you saying sort of the atmosphere of confidence has slightly dampened in Washington over the past few months. And you do speak to an administration official who mentions that actually some of the protest from the left or opposition from the left over Gaza is a weak point for the Republicans. Can you expand on that a bit for us?
Yeah, it's not so much that it's from the left, but that it's also coming from the right.
Yeah.
And Israel has really caused problems for Trump. And I think that's for two main reasons. The first reason is that the America First nationalism that is so important to many in the MAGA movement, that the interests of the American people should come first and America just stop being this policeman around the world, and the age of liberal internationalism, which was represented by the neoconservatives, is over. They would see, therefore, the prioritization of Israeli interests, as they see it, over American interests as completely incompatible with what Trump was elected on. The second reason, I would say, is this growing, rolling anti-Semitism on the online right. And this is where the Epstein question comes in, because there has been a suggestion by people like Tucker Carlson, for instance, that Epstein was working for Mossad, as we spoke about last week. And so essentially there's this big ecosystem of anti-Semitism that some in the administration are very conscious of. And that's why it's been such a problem for Trump. And then the other thing I think is interesting is where the Democrats are on this. I mean, you've seen it in the UK that the position of the main centre-left party is shifting, and something similar is happening here. A member of Congress said to me the other day that people are now saying things they wouldn't have said before. I mean, the obvious criticism is that it's too late and they're only responding to the news, and perhaps this is a cynical move because polls suggest that the Democratic base is much further to the left or much more pro-Palestinian than the Democrats in Congress. But that shift is definitely happening, and the sort of bipartisan, unquestioning support for Israel seems to have definitely taken a hit.
I mean, is there much in this idea that if the left could focus on those kind of things that point to an internal tension within the Republican Party, then there is a route to revival for them?
Maybe. I mean, I would never bet on the Democratic Party. I mean, one of the big problems at the moment is that they're leaderless. It's not like the UK, where there's always a party leader. They're essentially competing figures within the party. So you've got all the people in Congress, the leaders like Chuck Schumer in the Senate, Hakeem Jeffries in the House. You've got prominent senators like Chris Murphy and Cory Booker and Elisa Slotkin, all of whom see themselves as potential presidential candidates, of course, but also figureheads who the media will listen to. And then the other thing you have is this swathe of governors who are very prominent. We already mentioned Gavin Newsom in California, Governor Pritzker, Andy Beshear, Wes Brown. There's this huge number of governors, which you don't really have in the Republican Party, which I find really interesting, who are all competing for attention and for the role of leader. So the big question here is the midterms, and that's where much of the focus now is, and whether the Democrats can capitalize both on the Epstein scandal, and there are certain people within Congress that are trying to do that, in particular Ro Khanna. They see that as a way in which to not necessarily mimic Trump, but to adopt some of his more ruthless politics. And they can recognize that this exposes Trump as a hypocrite. It speaks to his base, it divides his party. So if they can make a strong argument, mostly framed on the victims need to know what actually went on, then they think that they can do that. I mean, I don't think you would have seen that 2-3 years ago. I mean, the Epstein scandal is so imbued with conspiracy and unknowns, and that many people in the Democratic Party, I think, would have almost seen it as below them. So the breaking of this decorum, this sense of like this polities or whatever it might be, seems to have its root in the fact that they now see the threat of Trump is so great that they need to take more drastic action. The other big thing that they think that they'll make hay with is the big, beautiful bill. This was a very large piece of legislation that Trump passed just in the past few months. And it cut Medicaid for lots of people. It increased the tax cuts for the rich. It gave tax cuts on some of his campaign pledges, such as cutting taxes on tips and overtime and Social Security. And they think that this is a perfect way in which they can prod the president and try and reclaim some of that left-wing economic populism, try and reframe the Democratic Party as the party of the working class, try and focus on some of the economic issues, and move away from the identity politics that is completely bedraggled them for 10 years now. So that's another shift that I think is really interesting. This greater focus, or this greater push, at least. I'm not sure it's universal yet, but this greater push to focus on economic issues over identity issues.
Yeah, and just lastly on sort of Democrat tactics before we move on to this issue of Trump's succession. How much, mimicking is there of Zoran Mandani's style, for example? I think you describe it as polite middle-class populism conducted in a suit and fought on social media.
Yes. I mean, it's interesting with Zoran Mandani, who is now the New York mayoral candidate for the Democrats. So there was a big upset. I think it was the most significant thing to have happened within the Democratic Party since Trump entered office. He's very much from the left, self-proclaimed socialist, a millennial, who beat Andrew Cuomo, who was a former governor, in the primary, completely unexpected. He started on about 0.1%, something like that. So his focus was very much on the economic issues. He proposed rent freezes, state-run grocery stores. He promised to deal with the homeless problem, these sorts of things. So it was very much. He was very much pitting himself against the Wall Street class, the city's billionaires. He was saying that we should redistribute some of that wealth to pursue progressive goals. So this form of left populism, economic populism, has led to, I think, a big question within the party about which route they go down. And there are some people in Congress who will say that Zoran might be able to win in liberal, progressive, young East Coast New York. There's no way in which he could win in the swing states in the Midwest. There's no way that people in Illinois would like some of his rhetoric on Palestine, for instance. And there are other people that actually look at him and go, yeah, I mean, there is some sort of far left tendencies here, but if you actually look at his campaign, he avoided some of these identity problems. He didn't go, I'm an immigrant, therefore vote for me, or I'm a non-white person, therefore vote for me. He was actually focused on the issues that voters care about. So it sort of works in both ways. I mean, Cory Booker, I think, refused to endorse Zoran Mandani the other day. So there's this tension and this reticence about whether they should endorse him or not. So it's a big question for the Democratic Party, how they can embrace this populist age, offer a more exuberant politics, something that can give a riposte to Trump, and speak to people's fears and economic concerns at the same time as trying to avoid a very local politics. And there's a tension there that is completely unresolved, and obviously you're going to see different tactics in different parts of the country, and it's not like there's any unifying national message that's coming out of the Democratic Party yet, in part because of the issues we spoke about earlier.
Mm-hmm. And there are, lastly, jitters that you report on about Trump's age and questions about who would succeed him. Can you take us through some of those conversations that you've been having?
Yeah, I think the question about Trump's age is really interesting because he shouldn't be able to run for a third term. We had, remember, those months of chatter about it, instigated by Trump himself, but also by Steve Bannon. And so the question comes to his succession. I mean, the figures that come up or that are mentioned are, J.D. Vance, Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, Don Jr., his son has also been mentioned quite a lot. I think there's another interesting aspect, which is what happens when Trump dies. The personality cult around Trump is so extreme, so well embedded in many people's political conception of what reality is, that I wouldn't be surprised if many people, when he does die, think that he's still alive or has been assassinated by the deep state. I mean, it sounds ridiculous, but I think that's a very real problem to grapple with, because conspiracies are so embedded in the American psyche, and in particular in the MAGA movement, that we should not underestimate the effect that might have.